Hi, this is Nalini Haynes and this is Dark Matter. Today I'm putting Juliet Marillier in the limelight. Juliet Marillier is a writer of historical fantasy. She's been a full-time writer for about 12 years after working as a music teacher and a public servant. Sounds like she should be in Canberra. She was born in Dunedin, New Zealand, the most Scottish city outside Scotland itself. I always heard you should say Scot, not Scottish, but there you go. But now lives in Western Australia. Juliet's novels combine historical fiction, folkloric fantasy, romance and family drama. The strong elements of history and folklore in her work reflect her lifelong interest in both fields. However, her stories focus above all on human relationships and the personal journeys of the characters. Juliet has won many awards for her writing, including 5 Aurealis Awards, 4 Sir Julius Vogel Awards, that's from New Zealand, as well as the American Library Association's Alex Award and the Prix Imaginales. She's active in her local writing community, mentoring aspiring writers, giving workshops and serving on the literary board of the Katharine Susannah Prichard Writers Centre. She's a regular contributor to genre writing blog Writer Unboxed. Juliet is a member of the Druid Order, OBOD, the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, and her spiritual values are often reflected in her work. The human character's relationship with the natural world plays a significant part, as does the power of storytelling to teach and to heal. When not writing, Juliet is active in the field of animal rescue, and today we have Zen, a rescued dog, joining us. She shares her home with a small pack of rescue dogs. Apparently there could have been 5, but Juliet's just brought one with her. She has 4 adult children and 7 grandchildren. Welcome, Juliet.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, what can you tell us about Blackthorne and Grimm?
Well, Blackthorne and Grimm is a series of 3 books. Historical fantasy, like my previous work, but in this case, it's very much focused on the personal journeys of those 2 characters, who are older characters than the ones I usually feature in the novels, and who I guess I wanted to write something more gritty that focused on real people who had real world issues and had a lot of trouble and difficulty at the start of the story and had a harder journey to make in the book than perhaps, it's not your standard sort of quests and dragons and sword fights kind of fantasy. It's definitely focused on those 2. Blackthorne is a healer, a wise woman, or has been one in the past, and has been through some incredibly traumatic stuff in her personal life, and is at a stage in her life at the start of the series where she's not really capable of doing that work anymore, because to be a healer and to work hearth magic, you've got to have inner calm and inner strength and balance, and if you've been through trauma, you lose all of that. And so she's shattered and disillusioned, and it manifests in her being very bitter and angry in the way she deals with things, and so she's got a long road to go. And Grimm, who is her offsider, we meet them first when they're incarcerated together in an extremely vile place. He's a big, quiet man, not particularly handsome, not particularly prepossessing. When we meet him at the start of the book, we don't know a lot about him, and he gradually emerges from that to become quite a wonderful person as the series develops, and he is really the calm, stabilising influence for the very edgy Blackthorne. So those 2 characters really are both suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Not that it was called that back in early medieval times, but it's been around. The damage done by anything very stressful and terrible in your life that screws you up mentally causes people not to be able to sleep or to suffer terrible nightmares, and particularly that sort of hypervigilance that returning soldiers sometimes have, where you never feel quite safe because you feel always that the thing is going to come back if you're off guard for a moment. So these two characters have to work through that individually, and they also work through it together and eventually support each other through the worst of that. So that's their story, which goes through 3 books. Blackthorne is driven by a desire to bring the person who most wronged her to face justice, a very difficult task. She's forbidden to do so by a mysterious mentor who rescues her and Grimm from their place of incarceration in the first book and makes her promise that she will only use her gifts for good, and that she will say yes to any requests for help that she receives, which is quite a difficult thing. And she's got to do all these things for the next 7 years. So she may not seek out this individual who's causing such harm for that period. That's very, very hard for her to promise, because the one thing that drives her is to bring this guy to justice, to see him face trial by his peers, because she's not the only person who has suffered because of his evil doing. So she's torn between the desire to go and do that and the promise that she's made that she won't. Something dire will happen. She's been threatened, if she breaks the rules. That's their story, and each novel as well has a standalone story, which is a fairy tale based mystery with quite a lot of uncanny elements. The book is, theoretically, it's set in early medieval Ireland. There's one real historical character in the entire 3 books. Everyone else is invented. But then the place names and the geography and so forth is Irish, and the folkloric uncanny elements are Irish as well. But several people, including someone else who interviewed me, didn't realise that it was set in the real world until it became apparent from something I said that was the case. They assumed that it was a secondary world that I'd invented. So I guess as a druid, I really have a theory that all those strange and uncanny tales way back when in history had their roots in something that was true and real. I'm not saying fairies were flying around in the sky, or that there were dragons or whatever, but that they've all got their basis in reality. And so it's not very hard for me to write a historical setting that has that underlay of the other world and the uncanny, and where human characters and other world characters interact in the story. So that happens in each of the 3 books.
Yes, that's a really interesting topic that you raised, because to me, I wasn't sure whether it was historical or whether it was fantasy, but then I've read, obviously, quite expansively.
Yes.
But it felt very strongly that it was kind of a medieval, well, Ireland, maybe England, something like that. No, not England, more like Ireland.
The names are all Irish, yeah.
Yeah. I didn't pick the real name, but I was kind of, wondering. So how did you come to base it, so much, you base fantasy on so much reality?
Probably because of that belief that the two, or not fantasy so much, but magic and the uncanny just runs alongside reality. And it's hard for me to write a story that is, I have written some short fiction that's more romance, and that sort of story I can do in a short form, but I think probably because growing up I read so much mythology and fairy tales, and I was just completely in love with it from as soon as I could have stories told to me. And whatever sort of story I try to write, that weaves its way in. Although out of I think this is my 20th novel, they're extremely variable in the balance between the historical story and the magical story. So some of them have just a little dab of magic where it helps to tell the story more effectively, and some of them are full of uncanny characters and magical goings on. Not sure that I really answered the question then, but it comes naturally without my having to say, how am I going to weave the the human world story and the other world story together.
You've mentioned a number of times now that you really loved this stuff when you were growing up. Can you point to any particular author or work that stands out for you from that time?
Certainly in terms of authors, I read all the fantasy works that people in that period read, so the Narnia books, and Tolkien had a huge impression on me when I was just sort of entering high school. And I can remember doing this giant book presentation to the English class that involved going through all the races of people and the languages and things in The Lord of the Rings and filling an entire blackboard with this sort of chalk diagram, and I bet the girls were all just thinking, oh, she's off again, you know. But I loved those back then, but it was far more the original fairy tales and mythology itself that really sort of captured the heart. And I do remember first up the fairy books edited by Andrew Lang or retold by Andrew Lang and others, the Violet Fairy book, the Green Fairy book and so forth, which were in the library when I was a child. And they are interesting in that they don't just focus on Western Europe the way so many of the books of fairy tales that in countries like New Zealand and Australia kids get. They include stories from India and Asia and Africa, and so it was quite a range of cultures, which was very interesting. I've now got a set of lovely illustrated editions of those. So loved those. And then when I first found the Mabinogion, which is the collection of Welsh stories, and that was, again, probably at the age of about 12, loved the gorgeous, poetic, lyrical way of method of storytelling in those. So even though I haven't used any of those stories in my own work, that was it was a sort of a writer's discovery moment, really, when I thought, wow, this is so beautiful. I just can sort of, you know, drown in the words. So that was very influential.
One thing that I remember from quite young was reading. We had readers as young as grade 2, and I remember reading some Celtic fairy tales in these readers for that grade, and I just remember feeling like, oh, this I wouldn't have even been able to put it in this kind of word, you know, these kinds of words, but I think I was kind of thinking, like, these are the stories of my people, like this, even without a really acute understanding, but realising that these are the stories of my ancestors, kind of thing. And I'm wondering, because we've become so homogenous in our society, I'm wondering if there's a bit of that's missing, or maybe that's why your stories have so much appeal, because you're giving, okay, we might all be white, but, you know, different white people have different stories that they kind of own or identify with.
Yes, I certainly agree with the finding the stories of your people, finding the stories of your ancestors. I don't mean looking for them, but just discovering them and feeling that, not an intellectual sort of understanding of that at all. It's a visceral kind of heart understanding that this is something that belongs to you. And I think it's very important that we do find those stories and recognise them. It's similar to going back to the place of your ancestors, even if you haven't lived there for ages, even if you've never lived there. I found, or going back to Scotland in particular, which is where most of my lot come from, just as soon as I stepped on the ground and started to walk about and look at things, it just felt that very deep connection. Might not happen for everybody, I don't know. It might have happened more for me because I had read a lot of the history and the mythology, and also because, as we've said, don't know if Dunedin is said to be the most Scottish place outside Scotland itself. Certainly grew up surrounded by those stories and the love of the pipe bands and the marching and the kilt. Scots is a language, Scottish is an adjective, Scotch is the whiskey, which you don't. Sometimes Americans talk about the Scottish as the Scotch, which is not right. But I think that's right anyway. Yeah.
Sounds pretty good. My grandfather was Stuart, and
Yes.
my grandmother's family comes from Ireland and Scotland, so I'd get a flea in my ear if I got it wrong.
What I just said may not have been wrong. That's just what I thought was right. So.
Well, definitely, you don't call the people Scotch.
I know that. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you about was when I was in primary school, I was given some Molly Hunter books. Now, your Druids, I don't know if you've read Molly Hunter, but your Druids are very different from hers. Hers were into human sacrifice and things like that. I mean, is that part of the Druid history?
Not at the. We certainly don't do it now anymore. Very interesting question. I've got there is a human sacrifice in one of my books. It's not. I'm trying to think back to. God, I can't remember. Yes, it is a Druid sacrifice. We don't know what they did. This is the thing, because the Druids didn't write things down. If they did write it down, they might have used the tree alphabet, but it wouldn't be saying, sort of meet me under the full moon and we'll kill Joe Bloggs by the well. It would have been something much more symbolic than that. So Druid law was an oral tradition. Learning many tales took years and years and years to become a fully fledged Druid. I would strongly suspect that those stories of human sacrifice come from Roman propaganda, or perhaps propaganda written by Christian monks who might have been in the same area at the same time, and that was probably a big pack of lies, but we can't prove that one way or the other. The human sacrifice story relates to a well which is in the north of Scotland, and in my book that's the sacrificial well. I can't remember the details, but there's a sort of an almost human sacrifice anyway, and it is a very, very eerie place. I've been there. It's the place I called the Well of Shades in one of my books, and it's really cold, I guess possibly just because it's underground, but you go down within this little hill, steep stone steps, and the well is very, very deep in the ground, and it's so cold, and it feels like the chill you'd feel if there were very unhappy spirits floating around. So it wasn't a place I particularly wanted to visit twice, but it was interesting to do so. And yes, it's said to have been the scene of human sacrifice. But yes, back to the question. There seem to be quite a lot of books that have got evil Druids who do all sorts of stuff, and I would challenge anyone to produce evidence for that. Certainly Druids wielded quite considerable power. You'll often read of a king going to battle and he'll have his Druid by his side advising him what strategic moves to make and what to do, and making, doing an augury and so forth, so that they could see what was propitious and what wasn't. I've written a book with a power-hungry Druid as well, because I think they probably were, like very astute senior politicians and presidential advisors, so they might have been the people who pulled the strings to make things work. But also they were scholars and musicians and peacemakers, as well as warmongers, so all sorts. And modern Druidry has dispensed with the human sacrifices and capering, and is more of a spiritual path that's very, very broad, but is based on our being part of the earth and respecting our heritage and building community, and in particular the importance of storytelling for both healing and teaching. So it's a philosophy that really chimes with everything that I believed before I joined the order. Yeah.
Your focus on storytelling, both within your books and as a storyteller yourself, is particularly interesting. In my former life, I studied to become a counsellor, and one of the key therapies that I think is really effective is narrative therapy, which is about finding your stories and reinforcing the good parts, and like finding that old teacher that you had in primary school who thought that you would go far or had faith
Yes.
in you, and building that relationship to reinforce the goodness. I'm wondering how much of this is really conscious, partly as a storyteller, but also partly as, have you actually heard of narrative therapy before?
Not until now. No, I haven't. But it's no surprise to me that works, because storytelling is so powerful. Yeah.
Oh, there are some really interesting case studies. If you're interested, the founder of narrative therapy is Michael White, and he's based in Adelaide.
Okay, I shall look him up and find out more. Yes, but to what extent is it culture? Is it conscious to write? You mean to write stories in a way that may help people?
Yes, and how much of it is conscious? Like, because Blackthorne and Grimm, they each have their stories, and it was interesting the way telling their stories was part of their healing process.
Yes. I think that was fairly conscious on my part, because I have seen that work. Interesting thinking about it, because it's not something I have done for myself as a healing mechanism, because I've just not been able to. But I can see when I'm writing about characters that I think with those two, Blackthorne and Grimm, sharing their stories at last was a sign that they'd reached the stage where they trusted each other above anyone else and were able to do that. And you have to be, I think, very close to someone and have that, that full trust in them to be able to sort of let go and get the words out, put your worst experience into words, I guess. Yeah.
And they kind of put the toe in the water and yank it back out again.
Yes. Yeah.
I loved the Cat Vale books. I found them in the 90s and I started reading them. Now, people have told me that if I reread them, the Suck Fairy will visit, and so I'm busy not rereading them.
What are they? So they're telling you that if you read them, what?
Oh, that they're not that good.
Oh,
but my memory was, and I read them at a different time and in a different place.
Yes.
But I absolutely loved Cat Vale for, being the Benedictine monk, and he'd go around and there'd be romance in each of the stories, and there'd be a murder mystery, and there'd be all these different elements. And reading over a course of a period of time, there were larger threads.
Yes, that's right, because he had a friend, didn't he, who was the local squire or something. Yes, yeah. I loved them too, and I would feel like you, I'd be worried about going back and reading them, but I'd probably still love them, because I've found with favourite books that that I've adored in the past life, when I was less conscious of the things I do as a writer and the things that I dislike in other people's work, reading as a writer, I can go back and read some of those books now. I'm just reading a complete change of tack. I'm just reading the newest novel by Gilly Cooper, who writes those sort of romping, bonking, horse and dog English aristocracy books, and there's a lot of stuff in her style things that I would tell aspiring writers never to do, head hopping and, but I can still enjoy that book. And if I go back to some of the writers I really loved in the 1970s, they'll have those quirks of style that people are generally told not to do these days, that are quite irritating. But if the story's good enough and the characters are good enough, and I think they probably are in the Cadfael books, then I'm able to overlook that and just enjoy reading the story.
I have to wonder, we analyse books as writers and reviewers and teachers, but how many readers actually do the same thing, or do they just read for the pure enjoyment?
I think many readers do just read for the pure enjoyment and really couldn't give a stuff if we're doing something structurally clever or, are being very careful with the style. I suppose people who love literary fiction do notice those things. Otherwise, they would find a lot of literary fiction very hard to get into. But, I mean, for me, the most impressive book to read is a book that combines the cleverness of the best literary fiction and a really gripping, wonderful story with great characters that I can believe in. And, you know, sometimes people will do that and get them both right, and that then is a very, very satisfying book to read. But I don't only read those. I read lightweight books as well. So.
Well, going back to Blackthorne and Grimm, because I particularly liked Blackthorne. Well, I like both of them, but I particularly like Blackthorne as a female character because she felt older. You know, like I turned 49 yesterday. Facebook has been telling everybody I turned 50. I'm not very happy, but yes, I turned 49 yesterday, and Blackthorne felt more like my age than your usual, you know, 20-something.
20-something, yeah.
And I really appreciated that. I also appreciated that she wasn't obsessed with domestic life. I mean, a good domestic story. Like, I mean, I like Monica McKerney's works, but
yes,
I don't want to read them all the time.
Sure,
so
yes.
I'm wondering how much of this was intentional on your part, and what led you in this direction with your writing?
I've been challenged a few times over the years about the fact that I tend to have a central pair of characters who are in that, you know, 17 to 30 age group, 30 pushing it really, usually 17 to 25. And several people saying, let's see a story with an older protagonist. Also people asking why I did that, and the reason why I did that wasn't to capture a particular readership. It was more to do with the period the books are set in and the fact that people did everything a whole lot earlier. So you'd be having your children at the age of 14 and you'd, you know, be running a household. Well, you might be, you know, you might get to leave it a couple of years, but they married very early. The blokes were off fighting wars and getting killed in their teens, heading up families, plying a trade. The women were working very hard, and those who perhaps weren't popping out children were looking after a household, perhaps, you know, hard manual work. People died young because of childbirth, particularly for women, and nasty accidents for which, you know, you couldn't sort of fix people and they bled to death, no antibiotics. So, you know, they were short lives. So people didn't live to my age, and if they lived to your current age, they'd have done remarkably well. You probably would have had to be a nun, I think, to survive. And so 40 was old. Even 35 was getting on a bit, you know. And the people that lived to be in my age, which is late 60s, were, you know, remarkably sage and ancient in those days. Therefore, it made sense to, if I wanted my protagonists to be doing the stuff, to put them into that younger age group. But I liked very much writing these two older protagonists. It's never actually stated how old they are. You can sort of work out how old they are. She would have been considered quite a mature age then because, as I said, short lives and so forth. I don't think Grimm's age is ever stated, but I assume that he's a little younger than Blackthorne. Yes, it was very good. It gave me it meant I could create a much more complex individual because she'd lived longer, more things had happened to her. She'd suffered in particular, and she just had that range of emotions, and she had to work really, really hard to come to terms with what had happened in the past, and I'd like to forgive herself, to find the worth in herself, even though it was obvious that others found her, you know, competent and worthy and likeable. But yeah, so yes, so that was what it was, and I'd love to go on and write more strong older female characters in whatever I do next. Yeah.
Can I ask you about your breast cancer, and do you think this has affected your writing, your maturity, the maturity of your characters?
Probably yes, because I think that any big crisis in your personal life affects how you do things afterwards. That experience with breast cancer, and I was, touch wood, very lucky in that I was one of the people who was able to have surgery and treatment, and with luck it's all gone, though you never know, you know, you have to be careful because it can come back. But when the first sort of shock of something like that hits you, and I was one of those people whose cancer was just picked up at one of the standard mammograms, the free, you know, by a yearly check or whatever, no symptoms whatever, had no idea I was sick, and there it was, right, you're in for an operation and you're having chemo and all that stuff. So it was quite a shock, and more of a shock than anything that had happened for quite a while. It really makes you see your life and your world quite differently straight away. You drop off a whole lot of stuff that has seemed to be very important, and there's just a small number of things that you realise are very important, like family in particular. And it's worth my reminding myself of that now. That was 2009, so it's a while back. Sometimes I lose sight of that wisdom that I gained now because life, you know, etc. But yes, but I think it's worth just focusing back on that set of priorities and thinking, right, our lives are full of all sorts of things that are not actually very important, and endlessly having the brain that goes round in circles repeating the angst about those things is not helpful. It's just a waste of time. So focus on what really matters, and let that take care of itself. So probably, yes, I think that it has changed the way I approach character. I did write a book the year I had cancer. I was only 6 weeks late getting it in, so I was quite happy with that. But it's a fairly angsty, introspective book. That was Seer of Seven Waters, which is the one with a trainee druid as the central character. And yes, that was more a reflection of my chemo vague brain and you know, the lack of focus in that year, which was mostly taken up with fairly taxing treatment. But I think I've processed it now, and perhaps, you know, that is coming out in terms of crises and resolution and people needing to be courageous in the face of difficulties and so forth, yeah. And learning to forgive yourself.
Yes, I found that theme with Blackthorne and Grimm, because it's such a strong theme with both the characters. I thought it was, yeah, really powerful. I mean, it goes all the way through, but I can't help thinking that the Tower of Thorns might be my favourite. I'm not sure. Because you have that exploration and a revelation without going into spoilers.
Yes. I was very pleased with the revelation, the backstory that came out in that book. That's sort of one of the passages that I'm quite proud of. And now I'm starting to wonder whether my love for the Cadfael stories back when might have influenced my dealing with that particular theme in that book. Who knows? I've forgotten them, but they are full of, the Cadfael books are full of such wonderful historical detail, aren't they? You know, just not dolloped on in large paragraphs, but just beautifully integrated into the story, which is wonderful.
And a blend of cultures, because I'm not 100% sure, but I think Cadfael's monastery might have been like on the Welsh-English border or something.
I think it's Wales or near Wales, and then you've got the Norman characters. Yeah, so it is interesting.
So, I mean, you're very firmly set over in Ireland, but you've still got this tribal culture that you're dealing with.
Yes.
So in a way, it's international politics, but it's in a microcosm, which is a little bit difficult for us to grasp here in Australia. Because a few years back, I got on Google Maps and I was Googling the distances between some of these places in Ireland and thinking, you know, but they had riots there and they're just, you know, and how can you be at war with your neighbour? And, you know, I think it's Dublin and Belfast are like an hour apart. It's like, no.
Yes, horrendous. It was very, very, very scary for people.
And I guess, but that kind of tribal culture, and I'm not trying to detract from the Oranges invading Ireland or anything like that, but that kind of tribal culture, it has its roots really, really deep.
That's right, because the patchwork of little kingdoms all over the place, like Dalriada and Meath and the various other places that are mentioned in my book. And while there was the High King wasn't really able to sort of determine what everybody else did, because you couldn't sort of hop in your car and whip up to Ulster and, you know, give someone a rap over the knuckles for doing the wrong thing. So although they got together and had these councils, it was very much every man doing his own thing within his own little territory. Yeah, very different.
So how much actual history have you explored and have you brought out in this particular trilogy?
Not much at all. I looked at the period, and it's possible to fix the date because there's, as I said, there's this one character who's a historical character, that's King Lorcan, who really just gets mentioned a few times. And the territories are territories that were, you know, kingships at that period, and the High King and so forth, and the way they conduct a legal hearing in the first book is all based on the Brehon law that was applicable then. So when I go into detail, it's more or less true to the period, but having said that, it is not a very historical series, and my answer to the people who say, oh, I can't tell whether it's set in real world history or an invented world, is that doesn't matter. It's just a story. You read the story. If you want to think of it as history, fine. People who don't recognise names in Irish might think it's an invented world, which is also fine. Yeah. Takes me back to Daughter of the Forest, my first book, which has incredibly flawed history, because back then I had no idea that people would care, and which actually started life as a fantasy story set in an invented world with completely different names for everybody, and ended up becoming Irish. Don't know why. Somehow it got turned into historical Ireland at some stage of the drafting and redrafting process. So, yeah.
I did a life drawing class many years ago, and my teacher said that if you draw from reality, you can your outcome can be so much richer and more detailed, and it can be so much better than something you're trying to imagine. And I'm actually wondering if this is also true in writing. So you've got a fiction story, but you're drawing on reality. You can really deeply visualize a place. You can work out how long it's going to get you from A to B, so you're going to get some continuity and consistency, but then you just put this fiction story in that setting, which really isn't that much different to contemporary fiction, except it's set in a different time.
Yes. I've certainly found, because I knew that I was going to be writing stories that involved the other world and the uncanny, I have found it much easier to write historical stories and tap into what people might have believed at the time about the uncanny and about, you know, otherworld beings that shared their geographical space, rather than write a story and make up something magical to impose on the story that's not necessarily related to that time and culture. So, with the exception of the Shadowfell books, which are pure fiction with no real history, I've always taken that approach with the magical elements, and I feel as if it makes them more real. People might say, oh, you're just too lazy to make it up for yourself, but so many novels with invented worlds. Now, there's some very, very good writing with, you know, wholly invented worlds, and there's some fairly not so good writing. And they do draw on the real world. They draw on real world history. Those that do the history well become, I think, much better. Well, they come across as much stronger stories to me than those that choose a bit from here and a bit from there, and we'll get a blend of sort of Asian, Indian and Finnish names and things with random apostrophes, and, you know, mixing up geography and mixing up botany and so forth. That doesn't work for me. again, it's like what we were talking about before. Some people aren't going to care. They're just going to think, gee, what a great story. It's so exciting. I wonder what happens. Other people like me and possibly you will look at those disparate elements and think this just doesn't work together. So maybe that's the, basing it on something real and building from that is a good way to go.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like the author has a commitment phobia.
Possibly, yeah.
So you've separated Blackthorne and Grimm from your other books in the sense that Blackthorne and Grimm as characters are both older, whereas your other characters are more young adult.
Yes.
You've mentioned one set that's completely fiction with no historical elements. Are there any key features, because I'm sure you're going to have some diehard fans here or some potential fans who are in the making. Are there key features of your different books that you'd like to mention? Are there elements that particularly set the stories apart?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. Yeah, probably yes. I always tend to feel that what I've written most recently is the strongest and the best, I guess, because I'm always learning and trying to improve my writing craft. So apart from the more mature protagonists, more interesting protagonists with darker issues to face, I enjoyed the structure that I used for these Blackthorne and Grimm series where I have several voices within the narrative. I think there are three point of view characters / narrators in the first two of these, and there are 4 in Den of Wolves, and each has his or her own voice. And so the story is divided into much shorter chapters than I've been used to writing, and I've had to work very hard on voice, and through that individual voice has come it's meant that the characters, I think, have sprung to life possibly more effectively than I have in some of my earlier work. On the other hand, Daughter of the Forest and those early books all had one young female narrator who told the entire story in first person, and I know that many of my fans, particularly the female ones, loved that approach very much because it enabled them to identify so closely with the central character. So that's valid as well. I've become more interested in structure as the more books I've written. I enjoyed writing the Shadowfell series, which are young adult books for young adults. That's the series that has no basis in real history. So the names are invented, but the names are not just chosen at random. The names, because I'm a bit of a historian, I looked at the setting, which really it's obviously Scotland. It's just never referred to as Scotland. The uncanny characters speak Scots. Couldn't help that. I started writing the book and these little characters just came out and they just all talked like that. So I let the less conscious part of the mind drive that forwards because that was the way it was. But it doesn't fit into any recognisable period of Scottish history, so it's fiction. I just wanted to write a story about a rebellion and about someone harnessing the forces of the uncanny to cooperate with human forces, and the fact that the otherworld characters didn't want to cooperate because that wasn't in their nature, and they'd rather just go to ground and let all the stuff, let the human kind of destroy themselves as they will, and then they'd come back when it was all over. And that's a story very much based around, I guess, my Druidry, because Druidry is based on nature, the elements of fire, air, water and earth, and the strength of nature, I guess, and our responsibility for nature. And so the Shadowfell series is based around a quest to find 4 elemental beings who will help the central character to get that cooperation between humankind and the other world to make the thing happen. And it's got lots and lots of folklore in it, so I had a fabulous time inventing what I thought would be the ultimate person to represent water and fire and so forth. So that was a fun book to write. It was enjoyable. And I also like the novels I've done that have got more history in them, such as Heart's Blood, which is a standalone Beauty and the Beast story, told in a way where the changes I made to Beauty and the Beast were to do with, it's one of those fairy tales that has rather a powerless heroine who is acted upon by other people rather than having her own agency. So I changed that, took out a lot of the magic, made my Beast character someone who had suffered a stroke in childhood rather than someone who had been bewitched by a bad fairy, so he was paralysed down one side. And that's set in a later period in Ireland, in the Anglo-Norman period, and has a lot of it. It was well-researched history. And my Viking books, Wolfskin and Foxmask, I did masses and masses of historical preparation of those, tried to get everything right. Tiniest bit of magic involved, but mostly a big fat historical novel, the first one. So, yeah, so that they're all different. The Seven Waters series has remained the most popular with readers, whether I like that or not. There it is, starting with my very first book. But I have had a lot of wonderful feedback on the Blackthorne and Grimm series from readers too. So there are people who appreciate that additional depth and maturity, I think, in the storytelling. And
you never know, some of your Seven Waters fans may turn to Blackthorne and Grimm when they get a bit older.
That's true. Well, I think some of them have, because they've probably grown up with the stories. The first, Daughter of the Forest, was published in 1999 here in Australia, and 1 year later in the States. So that's a while now. So the readers who were 17 back then are going to be in their 30s now. So, yeah.
Oh, well, we all get older and our tastes change. Now, I hope you did mention earlier, and I got so excited I forgot the question that I was about to ask. You mentioned writing more mature characters. Are you in the process of writing your next book?
No, I'm in the process of planning my next book, but I am still having to deal with the changes in the publishing world, which mean that publishers, particularly the big publishers, are being very cautious and a bit prescriptive about what they'll take. So it hasn't been accepted yet, what I have in mind, so I can't talk about it very much. It is a story that has two female protagonists, one older, one younger. It has a lot about witches and magic, and it's historically based. It's based on a fairy tale. So that's as far as it goes. So whether it'll come to fruition, I'm not sure. In the past, it has been much easier for me to submit a proposal and get the tick quite quickly. It's been quite difficult this time, which is why I haven't. Normally I would be submitting a new novel in January, February. It's not going to happen next year because it's not going to be done. So people will be having to wait. But I hope it'll happen, because it's a great story. I love it very much.
It sounds great. I want to read it. Maybe in a post-Lionel Shriver world, there'll be a little bit more uptake.
Who knows?
Okay, so what else is coming for you? Apart from nursing Zen so he doesn't freak out with thunderstorms.
He's gone to sleep now, which is good. He's got his pressure jacket on that keeps him calm. So I've got a trip to the States coming up. I'm actually going to be in America when the presidential election happens, which is going to be a strange experience. So I'm attending the World Fantasy Convention. Then I'm going to a small convention in Atlanta, which is based on Harry Potter and magic, at which I'll probably be the person who knows least about Harry Potter, but I'm there to present some sessions and as a guest. And then I will be at the Writer Unboxed Unconference in Salem, Massachusetts, which I'm really looking forward to, because that is a fascinating place, I'm sure. Never been there.
Will there be a witch trial?
I don't think so, but I think we'll do some touristy things while we're there. But it's a whole week of writing workshops and just writing together and doing interesting things. And I've got 2 workshops to present there, and I'm doing some critiquing for some people. So then I will come home to my babies and hope that they haven't missed me too terribly. Yes.
Well, I hope you do better than I did with my cat. She still hasn't forgiven me.
And that was only a weekend, yes? So I'll be away for 3.5 weeks. It's going to be very hard for them. Anyway, that's all right. I will probably not miss them once I've gone because I'll be so busy that I won't have time. Yeah.
Well, good luck with all your travelling, and I really want that book.
Yes. I'll get you to canvass my publisher if it comes to that. Yes, yeah, we'll see. Look, that's sort of sitting in the back of my mind because I knew that I had a feeling that inevitably we'd come to the stage where what I passionately wanted to write was not going to be what would sell well enough for them. And now that they're very cautious, they want something they know is going to make big bucks. And I know that I am not going to want to do something that's kind of contrived to try to fit that mould. It's hard to tell what the mould is anyway. They can't really spell it out. The reverse side of that is that I am not really keen on facing all the technicalities of self-publishing and I hate self-promotion, and you have to do it even more as a self-published author. I mean, I would have the advantage of having an existing readership, I know, but I'd much rather be spending my time writing than doing all the stuff, getting it up on whatever platform and formatting and all the rest of it, and then having to keep telling people, here's this great book that I've written. That just doesn't come naturally to me. So we'll see. It might be an option. The other option might be reverting to one of the reputable small presses here in Australia and seeing if they would take it and just publish locally. So we'll see.
Well, good luck.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for talking to Dark Matter.
It's been lovely talking to you. Thanks.